Nick helped her get out of her flight suit, clean up and change into better suited clothes, and Laura, beyond the point of modesty, let him. It had nothing to do with her being blind or his being a doctor either. Given the circumstances, it just didn't matter. They spoke as she changed, and she kept getting the impression that she wasn't moving nearly quick enough. Nick's increased cadence and high-rising intonation gave every word a thinly veiled sense of urgency, and without seeing facial expressions, it was the only way she had to read him. He explained that Alex had not been trying to attack Dimitri at all, but had slipped into a state of mental delirium and wanted nothing more than to verify their reality with his own sense of touch. The situation escalated quickly between the two men, and it was unfortunate for them all the way it turned out. Apparently, the strain of the last few days had been too much for Olympus's main engineer, and he had snapped long before the Daedalus made port. It hadn't helped any that the two men had been led to Base 6 by a false alarm touting blockage in a ventilation shaft, and then trapped there for the last 2 days without food, water, or a toilet of any kind. "You can bet your ass there's some blockage in the shaft now," Nick joked, and had she not been standing nearly naked, it would have qualified as TMI. But instead it produced a real chuckle from both of them. Astronaut Geary was somewhat crude, with the mouth of a sailor, but she could tell, by the time she had been clean, an OSS jumpsuit on, that she really liked the man. He didn't seem to have much of a filter between his mind and his mouth, not mincing words in the least. But he seemed to be a straight shooter, which was part of what she loved about Dimitri so much. And Mike. Once she had her boots laced up, he was insisting that they leave the med bay, that they were most likely being watched. Laura refused to budge this time without some answers first. Where were they going? Why were they running? Who were they running from? On top of all that, she was demanding that they go back and help Dimitri. Yeah, they may have still been alive, but they couldn't just leave him passed out on the metal docking platform. And Alex too, for that matter. Nick could see her determination, and by her best guess, was probably too exhausted himself to drag her any further. With the frustration plainly evident in his voice and a sigh after every other sentence, Nick did his best to explain what he could. For starters, he didn't know where they were going, just that they had to keep going or risk being trapped in whatever room they happened to be in. More than 40 hours ago, he and Alex had contemplated trying to access the only real weapon aboard the OSS, a 9mm handgun locked in a safe in the commander's office. But the only way in was with a numeric code, only known by the acting commander. The idea had been nothing more than a viscous tease to them, but Laura made a mental note. Dimitri would know that code. It was another reason they needed to go back and get him. If not sooner, then definitely later. Nick paused, and promised more answers if they could just start moving to a new location. Any new location. Laura reluctantly agreed, and let him lead her, hand in hand, out of the medbay and toward the housing units. It was his contention that, being some of the only areas without cameras, if they could get into one of the apartments unseen, they could finally rest and formulate some sort of plan. He repeatedly stressed that the need for stealth was important, but she could only be so covert, shuffling along at his side and slightly behind. Nick held her left hand while she traced the cool metallic wall with her right. She tried to work through the conundrum in her head, and to her, their antagonist couldn't have been more obvious. "Commander Milner," she said, her voice just above a whisper. Without slowing his pace, Nick looked over his shoulder at her. "What about her?" He shared her hushed tone, and Laura found that she actually preferred it in her current state of blindness. There was something about the tone and volume of the words that came her way which affected her ability to process them properly. having to rely solely on an auditory palette for the world to color itself, had created unique and surprising effects on the way her brain was rewiring itself. But this was hardly the time for scientific analysis. For that reason alone, she hadn't even begun to wonder why all the abstract hums, beeps, whirs, and other background noises that made up the station seemed to drift through her mind as vibrant colors, instead a cacophonous kaleidoscope of Olympus's soundtrack. It made her dizzy if she let herself focus on it. That's who we're running from. Commander Milner. I bet she went off the deep end, like Alex, except worse. She deceived all three of you and tricked you into doing exactly what she wanted you to do. I mean, I haven't got it all figured out yet, but it's something like that, right? This didn't seem to halt Nick momentarily, and just as she was sure he was about to confirm her suspicions, he said, "Are you hungry?" Offbeat and random seemed to be the man's forte, and Laura's mouth literally dropped open. In point of fact, however, she wasn't. It would be another 12 hours at least before her body would be ready to start accepting solid foods again. I can't eat. I just boarded. Didn't you say you were the medical officer? She was teasing with her jab. Under the current circumstances, anyone could be forgiven for a large degree of scatterbrain. Of course, he agreed. However, I'm hungry. As if on cue, his belly rumbled in confirmation. I helped myself to a nutrient shot back in the med, but we hadn't eaten in a couple days. I'm going to need a little something. Laura had no great alternate plan to propose, so she simply shrugged her shoulders as if to say, whatever, and allowed him to adjust their course accordingly. They shuffled along quietly together for some distance before Nick finally revealed what had been troubling his mind. Commander Milner. His voice was soft and low and conveyed a somber seriousness. Made sure that everyone called her Jill. She was unlike anyone else you'd ever meet. She was a pioneer, and in my personal and professional opinion, she could have been one of the greatest deep space astronauts of all time. The commander was something of a hero of mine. I would have given my life for hers, without deliberation. The anguished pain she heard at the edges of his sentences sounded like it might break into sobs at any moment, and she totally understood when he needed the time to collect himself. Within a few minutes, they found themselves in Kitchen C, just outside of Cafeteria 47, otherwise labeled the Rainbow Room Bar and Grill. Grabbing a menu and reading it aloud as they made their way back to the meagerly supplied shelves, Nick's mouth began watering for something significant. But he would have felt like a hypocrite if he had taken the time to fry a steak or whip up some bacon and eggs when he had pressed her so hard about their mobility while she was struggling to get out of the modified spacesuit. She was inclined to agree. Instead, he pocketed several of the NASA-distributed granola bars, which were designed somewhere underground by DARPA, and tore into one immediately. Laura was quite familiar with the bars herself, having on more than one occasion brought them back home to Mike and Kevin, who had liked them a lot more than she did. They didn't taste bad, with their genetically engineered oats, synthetic chocolate, and hundreds of chemicals designed to improve production, however. By her recollection, the ones from Walmart were worse. While slowly sipping her water, Laura stood and listened to him lip-smack his way through two of the questionable health food bars, and she couldn't help but to think about her commander again. Everything a growing cosmonaut needs to become big and strong, she said to herself more than anything. It did earn a from Nick, but whose mouth was too full to say anything else. Oh, it's just something Dimitri liked to... You know what? Never mind. Now was not the time for nostalgia. Once she felt certain that the expert's mouth was empty enough to speak, she put a little more pressure on what she knew was already a sore spot. So Nick, Commander Milner, You got so upset because of what she's done, right? I mean, you would have laid down your life for her and now she's trying to kill you. Believe me, the hellish irony isn't lost on me. I can understand how painful that must be. Laura waited patiently for Nick to respond, hoping for some continuation of the story. There were still so many questions that needed answering, not the least of which was, where the hell was Rukia in all of this? She had been wary to bring up the subject of her friend since the last time they heard from her. She painted quite the picture of opposition between herself and Nick in particular. As she waited, his unspoken seconds turned into minutes, and the longer it stretched, the more uncomfortable she began to feel. She would have given anything to see his face. There was no way for her to know exactly how much time had passed before Nick cleared his throat and broke the silence, or that he had been spending those minutes fighting to keep his emotions in check. But it was long enough that she would have said something herself had he not beaten her to it. "You've got it wrong, Mrs. Hillman." "Laura," she corrected him. "Laura's fine." It wasn't so much that she felt the current situation dictated less formality, which it did, but rather a case of her really not wanting to hear her last name, Hillman, said aloud. It was the name she took from her husband and shared with her child, and unfortunately, she might never be able to hear it again without thinking of them both involuntarily. It was yet another unanticipated idiosyncrasy in the brave new world that was the rest of her life. "Laura. Right, of course," Nick agreed before releasing his 100th sigh in the last hour. "There's no really easy way to say this, so I guess I'll just say it. The commander is..." Nick didn't get to finish its sentence, or if he did, she was unable to hear it. Without warning, a vibrating alarm filled the room, echoing off the kitchen's metal walls, and creating the effect of 2 or even 3 sets of competing digital beeps. It was accompanied by flashing red emergency lights she was unable to see, and when Nick spoke again, he had to do so at very nearly the top of his lungs. "It's a lockdown," he screamed. "She's found us. We have to go now." Grabbing her hand, he jerked her towards the door with significantly more force than he meant to, almost sending her to the floor again. As difficult as it had been trying to navigate her environment without the benefit of sight, it was unimaginably worse now that her hearing was being taken away as well. The simple act of just placing one foot in front of the other became a Herculean task, and Laura allowed herself to be pulled more than progressing by her own volition. One foot shuffling behind the other, she prayed she wouldn't trip over anything, including her own feet. Well aware that she wasn't being expedient enough, it didn't help when Nick called out something from in front of her, most of which was lost to the audio assault. All she was able to make out was, "Need to hurry and trapped for good." She felt like she had a pretty good idea of what he was trying to get across. They made it out of the kitchen just before the doors sealed behind themselves, and the blaring echoes behind them apparently locking the process. Part of the way through the rainbow room before the familiar alarm erupted again. The open space and linen-draped walls of the dining area absorbed a large portion of the mentally grating blasts, allowing her to think and walk a little straighter than she had in the confined spaces of the kitchen. Moving much quicker as a result, the motley pair easily made it out of the lounge. Oddly enough, however, the alarm stopped. As soon as they did, ceasing the exact moment they crossed the threshold, the door didn't close and lock, and they stopped just outside of it. "She's fucking with us," Nick concluded, and after a moment, "I need you to hang tight for just a second." "What? What the hell are you talking about?" She didn't sound happy. "I dropped my bag. I have to run back in and get it." "What bag?" "I had a bag of some supplies. Food, medicine, the like. I've been grabbing stuff as we went, and it must have fallen off my shoulder back there. I think I see it. It's not far. It'll only take a moment to run back and grab it." "What about the door?" Laura asked. "The alarm?" That alarm is nothing more than a 20-second warning of a lockdown, even if she shouldn't be able to override it. If it goes off again, I should have more than enough time. I'll be quick." He pulled softly and reluctantly. She let his hand slip away. She couldn't have really stopped him anyway. As hard as it was to accept, the fiercely independent woman she had been was having to come to terms with her current state of vulnerability, and it was having to do it so damn fast that it probably wasn't good for her psyche. The state of dependence she had been forced into was bringing back emotions not felt since early childhood, and random thoughts that were better suited keeping their distance. "Don't leave me, Daddy. I'm scared of the dark without you." She followed his hustling progress as well as she could with his offering. "Almost got it. Here it is, and I'm coming back now," to aid her as he went. Laura could hear his heavy breathing again once he was only a few feet away, but he never quite made it back to her side. The door to the Rainbow Room's main entrance did close and lock, without warning, sealing off the space between them with an airtight and soundproof glass door. If she hadn't lost the ability to see, the sight of Nick screaming and pounding on the other side of the door, eyes wild and panicked, would have probably made her sick. Instead, her only awareness was of the low vibrating hum of Concourse Delta, and the complete and utter helplessness felt in the pit of her stomach. It was 1979 again, and all she wanted to do was pull the sheets over her head to hide from the monsters under her bed and in her closet. Laura could feel herself regressing exponentially, and she was getting dangerously close to the point of not coming back. "Laura," a voice broke through her psychological swan dive. A familiar voice, and the joy she felt upon hearing it played a crucial part in holding back the madness. There was still fear that it may have been an auditory hallucination. And when she heard, "Oh God, Laura, it is you!" her chest swelled as she tried to keep her ailing eyes from producing any tears. "Rukia!" she cried towards the direction of the voice, and then the women were clutching each other in a warm embrace. It seemed like a lifetime since they had been together face to face, and yet neither of them wanted to let go. "I was so worried about you, Rukia. I thought maybe Commander Milner had done something to you," Laura whispered as they hugged. "I'm sorry, Laura. I couldn't say anything until I got you away from Nick. I've been monitoring you guys and waiting for a chance to isolate you. You have no idea how lucky you are." Laura pulled back and shook her head. "I don't understand. Nick was trying to help." "No, Laura. You don't understand." Rukia's voice had something of an edge to it. "I don't know what Geary said or did to you, but he's a master liar. If I were to tell you what he had planned for all of us, it would sicken you. This man is a lunatic. I probably saved your life." That was so hard to believe. Nothing anyone was saying seemed to make any lick of sense. Laura made a half-hearted attempt to sort the drastically different accounts when she remembered the most important thing. "Dimitri. We have to go back and help Dimitri." "Yeah," Rukia agreed. "We do. I already moved Wang to a secure location, but Commander Kaspersky will still need our assistance. I managed to get him on a stretcher, but haven't had a chance to move him. I thought it was more important to stay close to you and Geary, watch for my opportunity. I don't know what I would have done if he had hurt you." Laura could hear the sincerity in her voice, and it did nothing but further her cloud of ability to judge the situation. If she could just get a clear picture of exactly what was happening on Olympus, it would make dealing with it a whole hell of a lot easier. "Where's Commander Milner in all of this?" Jill Milner felt like the missing piece of the puzzle. "In the last communication you said she'd been put... what, in the brig? Is she still... can we find her?" "Definitely." Rukia squeezed Laura's hands, which she'd still been holding. I got her out of lockup shortly after I was able to free myself. We can go see the commander right now." Not what Laura was expecting. The revelation came as a genuine shock, and despite the other woman's words, she couldn't stave off the feeling of mistrust she had for the OSS's should-be former commanding officer. Maybe it was just the fact that she was the only crew member Laura had yet to encounter, but ever since the first signs of chaos aboard the station made themselves known, she stayed behind the scenes. It seemed logical to presume that she was the one pulling the strings behind the crew's animosity. She was the commander after all. "Okay, let's do that." Laura was still wary, but she needed to know. Commander Milner, or Jill, if she believed Nick, could either be a strong ally, if there was a schism in power here, or she will have found the mastermind behind all of their current troubles. Rukia said okay, and Laura let her lead the way, making better progress than she did with Nick's insistence on her sneaking, but amazed, nonetheless, that her muscles allowed her to continue on at all. The fear of dropping at any second and passing out from exhaustion was a legitimate concern. For that reason, more than any other, Laura remained relatively quiet as they went. The majority of her cognitive abilities spent concentrating on continuing to place one foot in front of the other and staying upright. Rukia remained relatively distracted as well, the tablet which she kept constantly in hand consuming most of her attention with its readings on all of Olympus's operations. The current situation had obviously forced her into a role with a lot more responsibility than that of a communications officer, and it seemed the station only continued to function properly through her diligence. At least that's the way it sounded as she spent the majority of her time tapping away at the touchscreen. It would have been impressive as hell if Laura had a spare synapse to fire off a thought about it. Laura didn't bother to ask where Rukia was leading her, and Rukia never bothered to tell her. In her current state of exhaustion, bouncing from one frantic situation to another, she had given herself fully to the notion of now being safe. Having been found by her old friend, learning that Dimitri was no longer laying on cold steel, and that both Alex and Nick, dangerous or not, were contained and alive was incredibly cathartic. It gave her well-worn adrenal glands a much-deserved break. They weren't required to actually walk, but for a short distance before Rukia was steering them into a mobility chamber, a glorified elevator that ran horizontally as well as vertically. It was probably a good thing too, as even with the transportation, it took nearly 20 minutes to arrive at their destination. By the time Rukia was sliding her onto the hard metal stool, Laura was so grateful to take the weight off her feet that it felt as good as a lazy boy. The stool was attached to a table which Laura surmised to be a dining area, and she put her head down on her arms like a preschool nap time. All she wanted was to sleep. The second she quit fighting it, she was out. When she finally came back to, her sleeve was wet with drool, and it felt like it had probably been a significant amount of time. Much like her time in the capsule, however, the ability to properly detect and measure increments of time was impaired beyond the point of any degree of reliability. Her body's internal clock had always been a source of consistency, and it came as a shock to discover how closely tied it was with her ability to monitor an actual clock. Outside of the steady hum of a few electric devices or appliances, the room was completely silent. "Rukia," she called out, her voice echoing off the cold walls. The acoustics sounded very similar to the kitchen she had been in earlier with Nick. "I'm here," Rukia replied from somewhere across the room. "You're okay." Laura was still tired and weak for the first time in a week. Her stomach was showing some interest in food. "How long was I asleep?" She could hear Rukia coming closer as she replied. "Not too long, but you were out good. I figured you'd probably need to recharge a bit." She wasn't wrong about that. "You were asleep just as long enough for me to take care of Geary." Any residual fogginess was quickly blown away, and Laura shook her head. "What do you mean, take care of?" What did you do to Nick? Relax. Rukia plopped down in the seat next to hers and put her hand on her friend's shoulder. It's all okay now. Her words were steady and even, and did a great job at conveying their honesty. Geary and Wang have both been processed. Now we're all on the same page. They won't be any more struggling for power, only survival. We can take care of Commander Kaspersky together, and the future can be, well, whatever we want it to be. Julia had no idea what the Asian woman was referring to when she spoke of the men being processed. But it could have been any number of things, from a decontamination routine to binding agreement. Regardless, the fact that they would all be getting along again was great news. Except, wait a second. It surprised her that it took her too long for the thought to reveal itself. But given the strenuous ordeal her mind had been made to endure, it probably shouldn't have. What about Commander Milner? Julie, I thought we were going to see her. Rukia sighed and took her hand off Laura's shoulder. Listen. Her voice took on a somber tone. I wasn't completely honest with you. Thing is, I didn't want to lay too much on you at one time. Rukia. Laura tried to match her even quality, not yet sure how to play the coming seconds. I think now would be the time to go ahead and lay it all on me. I appreciate your concern, but I'm not a child you need to protect. There were a few moments of silence as Laura allowed Rukia time to consider her words. Except it wasn't complete silence. Beneath the electric hums and even their breathing, there was a small gritty sound Laura knew very well, having heard it from her father for her entire life until his death. She knew that Rukia was grinding her teeth together. She also knew that it was generally a result of stress. Okay, Rukia began. Here's the truth. Commander Milner had been forced into the brig, as I stated before, but what I didn't tell you was that she committed suicide while she was in there. By the time I was able to get to her, she was gone. It was too late. She took a moment to swallow the lump in her throat before continuing. It had been too much for her. The bombs on Earth and the mutiny had her on the edge. And then when she was told that the Daedalus never made liftoff, it just pushed her over, I guess. Laura understood why Rukia hadn't wanted to tell her. It was tragically sad, and even though she had never met the woman, she could see how the news of someone killing themselves due to enduring horrible circumstances, and then learning of new ones, might not be the best story to share with someone who was also enduring horrible circumstances. Rukia had chosen the temporary sin of omission over diluting what was already a thin morale. Okay, Rukia. I'm so sorry. She was, too. It had to have been devastating. Laura put her arms around her friend and the two women embraced for several seconds before Rukia quickly pulled away. Oh shit. Something had her attention. What is it? Laura asked. I don't know. An alarm in engineering. E-level. It could be nothing, but I need to check it out real quick. Now listen, give me 30 minutes or so and I'll be back, and then we can talk about what we were going to. Okay. Laura nodded her head. And then get Dimitri. Yeah, Rukia agreed. Add Nick and Alex too? Yeah, Rukia confirmed. They'll be there too. I have to go, Laura. Try to get some rest. She stood and quickly made her way out of the room, calling back to her just before the door slid shut. I'm really glad you're with me. It put a smile on Laura's face, and she put her head back on the table and spread her arms out with a yawning stretch. The fingertips of her right hand made contact with an unusual object, and stretching further, she took hold of something. Odorless and firm, in a vacuum-sealed plastic. It wasn't completely solid, but felt tender and wet. If she didn't know any better, she would have sworn it was a large, meaty steak. The problem with that, however, was that there should have been little to no meat aboard the station until, and if, the Aryan 6 made contact. And it definitely wouldn't be just lying around on the table like this. Rukia must have had it out for her next meal. Satisfied with the probable logic of that possibility, Laura would have to let it go too, had her hand not encountered a second package, differently proportioned but similar in consistency to the first. She carefully slid down 2 seats until she found herself directly in front of a small pile of the mystery packages. Working them through her hands one at a time and racking her brain in the world's worst guess the Christmas present game. She finally came across one she could recognize, and it made her throw up a little in her mouth. It was a human foot. The horror that gripped her as she held the wrapped appendage in her hands would not allow her to drop it, even though that was all she wanted to do. Her mind seemed as frozen as her body, and the only thought she could produce was, "This can't be real," which repeated over and over. It took a considerable mental exertion to free her hands off the offensive object, and Laura struggled to consider her options. Was she really just going to sit here and wait on Rukia without knowing for sure? There was always the possibility, albeit unlikely, that she had misconstrued and misinterpreted what she thought she just felt, but she had to know for sure. Reluctantly, she slowly peeled away the gel-infused bandage from her eyes and tried blinking several times. Remarkably, and with complete thanks to the Prometheus injection, they were already significantly better. There was a slight burning sensation in a large black spot that filled the center of her vision, but the flashing was gone, and if she concentrated, she could make out the items on the edges of her periphery without actually looking directly at them. It took several mind-numbing minutes of practice and an onsetting headache before she could turn herself at the proper angle to discern the pile of packaged meat. And yes, it was meat. It was identifying a woman's hand that put her in motion. It was definitely time to get the hell out of there. Scanning the room and in turn locating the exit proved to be even more difficult. Every time she thought she saw something useful, her instinct was to look at and then obscure whatever it was. It was frustrating to no end, but it was better than being blind. Sorting out her environment was time-consuming, but it eventually came together. She was in another kitchen, a very large kitchen, which seemed to spread out endlessly. She had navigated past a couple of preparation tables before stumbling across a large wooden butcher's block, drenched in bright red blood, which she could only take in at a cockeyed angle. There was something with stained metal buried in the wood, but the persistent instinct to look right at it kept her from fully distinguishing its form. It was disturbing nonetheless, and her best guess was that it was a meat cleaver. Walking sideways to navigate her way around the gory table, she nearly lost her balance when her foot slipped in a slicked puddle of red. Even with her poor tracking abilities, the sickening trail of blood was easy to follow, leading past the pile of soaked and shredded OSS uniforms and straight to the vacuum sealing machine, where it began to dry and become sticky. The pile on the large table next to the machine, designed to maintain the freshness of food for the long haul of deep space, nearly took her breath away. The segmented parcels made it impossible to equate to human form, but the sheer mass of it dictated that it had to be more than one person. Laura's stomach lurched violently, and she was suddenly grateful there was nothing for it to produce. Had Rukia done this? Was she looking at the remains of Alex, Nick, and Jill? It seemed inconceivable, and was at such odds with everything she knew as sanity. Spinning on her heels and nearly slipping in blood once again, Laura decided she had lingered long enough, when the door, which she had yet to locate, slid open somewhere to her left. She cocked her head and did her best to target the direction, but could make out very little beyond the fact that someone had entered. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed part 5 of Human Nature. I should be getting these out a lot quicker now. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure to leave that like, hit the subscribe button, and click the bell so you can be notified when the next part of the story pops up. Also, I will be in the comments on Twitter and on Instagram for the next 15 minutes, talking to you guys about whatever you want to talk about. And as always, my Darkness Militia, have a terrifying evening.